The air in Courtroom 7B of the Richard J. Daley Center was thick with the silent, suffocating tension of high-stakes family law. Sunlight filtered through the high-arched windows fell in dusty shafts upon the polished mahogany and the worn-out faces of the assembled. On one side, a fortress of power and privilege stood in stark relief against the solemn backdrop. Robert Wellington, a man whose name was synonymous with Chicago real estate, sat with the relaxed confidence of a king surveying his dominion. His $3,000 suit fit him like a second skin, a suit that likely cost more than the worn couch in Janet Thompson's living room. Flanking him were two lawyers, their expressions a study in detached professionalism and thinly veiled contempt. Dr. Mitchell, the lead attorney, a man with a head of immaculate silver hair and a razor-sharp tie, shuffled through a stack of documents with an air of practiced boredom, as if this entire proceeding were a trivial interruption to his morning. On the opposing side, a world away yet only a few feet apart, sat Janet Thompson. Her hands calloused and pale from years of long shifts, as a nursing assistant were clasped tightly in her lap, clutching a handbag whose leather was peeling at the corners. The lines of fatigue around her eyes were a map of the last 9 years of her life, a journey she had undertaken alone. She watched Robert from under the shadow of her brow, her gaze a complex mixture of fear, defiance, and an almost unbearable sorrow. The man who sat across from her was a ghost from a past life, a brief and regrettable encounter whose consequences now threatened to unravel the very fabric of her existence. Beside her, quiet as a shadow, sat her son David, 9 years old, yet he seemed older. His wire-rimmed glasses slightly askew magnified his large, intelligent eyes that took in every detail of the room with an unnerving calmness. He was a small boy, all sharp angles and restless energy contained within a still, patient frame. While the adults around him fidgeted, whispered, or simply radiated anxiety, David was a point of perfect stillness. He was watching everyone from the judge to the stenographer, his gaze methodical and observant like a scientist studying a new species. Judge Harrison, a man with the weary wisdom of 3 decades on the bench, cleared his throat. He had presided over countless custody disputes, seen the worst of human nature unfold in the quiet dignity of his courtroom. He was prepared for the predictable script, the well-funded lies, the emotional appeals, the relentless attack on a mother's character by a father suddenly interested in his offspring. He glanced at the docket, then looked up, his eyes passing over the faces of the Thompsons and the Wellington party. He was just about to begin the formal opening remarks when a sound small yet monumental in its implications sliced through the reverent silence. It was the quiet scraping of a wooden chair against the floor as David Thompson, the 9-year-old boy, stood. Robert Wellington's head snapped up. Dr. Mitchell's hand paused in midair, a page of legal notes half turned. The stenographer's fingers stilled over the keyboard. A collective audible gasp rippled through the gallery of onlookers, a mix of journalists and curious public who had come to witness the drama of the wealthy real estate magnate's latest spectacle. "I am my mother's lawyer," David said. The words, delivered without a hint of fear or artifice, resonated with a clarity that seemed impossible from a child. They did not echo. They simply existed, a statement of fact, dropped into a space where only pretense and legal jargon were supposed to dwell. Robert Wellington almost choked on the breath he was holding. He shot an incredulous glance at his lawyers, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and suppressed laughter. This was a joke, a tasteless, foolish little bit of theater that the other side had cooked up. "I'm sorry, young man." Judge Harrison said, his voice slow and even, but with a flicker of something in his eyes that was not annoyance but curiosity. "This is a legal proceeding, a matter between adults." Janet Thompson's hands flew to her mouth, a silent scream trapped behind them. A wave of both pride and terror washed over her. Pride for her son's courage, terror at the audacity of his action, and the inevitable crushing humiliation that was to follow. She had taught him to be brave, to stand up for what was right, but she had never in her wildest nightmares imagined a moment like this. Her whispered, "David, please sit down," was lost in the vastness of the room. David, however, remained standing. He adjusted his glasses, a slow, deliberate gesture that seemed to draw all the attention of the room. He was not a nervous child. He was a focused one. "I know, Your Honor," David said, his voice unwavering. "And I also know that according to Article 12 of the Convention on the Rights of the Child ratified by the United States, I have the right to express my opinion on all matters that directly affect me." The silence that followed was not just the absence of sound. It was the complete, utter stillness of a world turned on its head. Dr. Mitchell, the seasoned lawyer who had faced down judges, corporate titans, and organized crime figures, found his perfectly manicured jaw go slack. He looked at the 9-year-old boy in a simple blue shirt and worn jeans, a boy who had just quoted international law, and for the first time in his long, successful career, he felt the cold, creeping sensation of being completely unprepared. Robert Wellington's face, which had held an expression of amused superiority moments before, now hardened into a mask of pure fury. How dare this boy, this child he had barely acknowledged, make a mockery of his case, of his lawyers, of him? He leaned over and whispered fiercely into Dr. Mitchell's ear. "Get this nonsense stopped," he hissed. "Now." Dr. Mitchell nodded, regaining his composure with the practiced ease of an actor. He rose to his feet, a tower of expensive fabric and condescension. "Your Honor," he began, his voice a smooth, authoritative baritone, "this is highly irregular. The child has no legal standing or capacity to— and if you truly cared about my well-being—" David interrupted, his voice cutting through Dr. Mitchell's with a shocking calm. "You would want to hear what I have to say, rather than trying to silence me." This time, the adults in the room, even the jaded journalists, shifted uncomfortably. David was not just a child. He was a force of nature, an unexpected variable that threatened to derail everything. Robert Wellington's gaze, which had been fixed on the judge, now flickered to his son. What was this? He had expected a tearful, scared boy, a vulnerable prop in his case. He had not expected this. "Your Honor," David continued, and now he opened a small, worn school notebook, its pages filled with what looked like a child's scribbles, but arranged with a chilling precision. "I have prepared a documented presentation on why I should remain with my mother, including evidence of the petitioner's true motives." He paused, his gaze lifting for the first time to meet his biological father's. Robert's eyes were a pale blue, cold and calculating. David's were a deep, rich brown, and in them Robert saw something he had never expected to find there: knowledge. A knowledge that was older than David's years, a knowledge that was heavy and burdensome. "Motives," David concluded, his voice low and serious, "that I believe the court will find very enlightening." Robert Wellington's face went visibly paler. What motives? What could a 9-year-old possibly know? The last time he had seen the boy, 6 months ago, he had been a timid, quiet thing buried in homework in a room filled with shabby furniture. How had that boy, in the span of 6 months, transformed into this confident, articulate opponent? A deep, primal sense of dread began to worm its way into Robert's gut. The confidence he had carried into the courtroom, the certainty of his victory, began to crack. Judge Harrison watched the boy and the man, father and son, locked in a silent psychic battle. He had seen thousands of lies in his career, but he had also developed an infallible instinct for the truth. And in the unwavering gaze of the boy, he felt something true, something genuine, something that spoke of a deep and righteous purpose. He looked at Dr. Mitchell, who was visibly flustered for the first time. "Dr. Mitchell," the judge said, his voice betraying no emotion, "you may present your arguments after the child has had his say." Dr. Mitchell's jaw tightened. He knew this was a mistake, a complete subversion of protocol. But there was something in the judge's eyes that told him to comply, that told him a line had been crossed, and that for the first time he was not in control. "Your Honor," Dr. Mitchell said, the words forced through his teeth, "this is a travesty." "No," David said, his voice cutting in again, sharper this time. "A travesty is a man who shows up 4 times in 9 years, then suddenly wants full custody. A travesty is a mother working 60 hours a week to raise her son, while the father, a multimillionaire, sees his child as nothing more than a problem to be solved." Janet Thompson's heart was hammering in her chest. For weeks she had watched David come home from school with books from the public library, books on legal codes, on children's rights, on corporate law. She had thought it was just a phase and intellectual curiosity from a gifted child. She had never imagined he was preparing for this, for a battle she was convinced they would lose. She had tried to talk him out of it, to tell him to let the lawyers handle it, but he had just looked at her with those calm old eyes and said, "What lawyers, Mom? We can't afford them. So either I speak for us, or no one speaks." The memory, so raw and recent, brought tears to her eyes. She had felt so helpless, so lost. But now watching him stand there so small yet so tall, she understood. He wasn't just fighting for her, he was fighting for them. He was fighting for their family, for their life, for their dignity. Dr. Mitchell, desperate to regain control of the narrative, tried to appeal to the court's logic. Your Honor, my client Robert Wellington is genuinely concerned about the welfare of his son. Ms. Thompson, while well-meaning, simply does not have the resources to provide the educational and social opportunities that a gifted child like David deserves. David's head tilted slightly. Interesting. He muttered almost to himself as he flipped through the pages of his notebook. Genuine concern. His gaze was now focused on Robert. May I share some facts about this genuine concern, Your Honor? Judge Harrison leaned forward on the bench, his judicial curiosity clearly piqued. Proceed, David. The courtroom was silent, every person hanging on the boy's every word. This was no longer a routine custody hearing. This was something new, something unprecedented. A child was about to expose the truth about a powerful man, and the world was watching. Robert Wellington, who had built his empire on secrets and deception, found himself trapped in a silent courtroom facing an opponent he had completely underestimated, an opponent who held secrets of his own. The stage was set, the first act of an impossible drama had begun, and everyone in that room knew with a certainty that was as frightening as it was thrilling that the climax would be something truly extraordinary. The hushed tension of the courtroom was a world away from the chaotic, opulent reality of Robert Wellington's life. The man who sat across from Janet, seemingly a pillar of corporate success, was in fact a colossus built on feet of clay, his empire on the verge of a silent, spectacular implosion. To the public, he was the owner of Wellington Industries, a real estate conglomerate that had reshaped the Chicago skyline. To the few who knew him intimately, or rather professionally, he was a man governed by two things: unbridled ambition and a chronic, gnawing fear of losing it all. The last 18 months had been a relentless series of professional and personal calamities. His third marriage, a union predicated on little more than mutual financial benefit, had soured into a vicious, high-stakes divorce. His wife, a shrewd socialite from a wealthy old-money family, had filed for a contested separation, and her lawyers were proving to be far more formidable than he had anticipated. They had uncovered a series of hidden accounts and secret investments threatening to peel back the carefully constructed layers of his financial life. But that was a mere tremor compared to the earthquake that had struck his business. A lawsuit from his former business partners in a failed venture had escalated from a petty disagreement into a sprawling legal war. They accused him of fraud, of siphoning funds and manipulating balance sheets to enrich himself while they were left to absorb the losses. The case, a grueling and public affair, had culminated in a jury verdict that saw Wellington Industries ordered to pay out a staggering $2.3 million in damages. The verdict was the first crack in his public image, a chink in the armor of a man who had always seemed invincible. The financial fallout was even more severe. The lawsuit and the divorce had bled his company dry, forcing him to liquidate assets at a loss, take out high-interest loans, and most humiliatingly beg for credit from the very banks he had once lorded over. It was during a desperate late-night meeting with his accountants that Robert had first heard of the trust fund. His mother, Eleanor Wellington, had been a woman of quiet strength and formidable intellect. She had seen through the bravado and bluster of her son, a quality that had always made their relationship strained. She had passed away when David was just 2 years old, and Robert, in his typical dismissive fashion, had neglected to inform his mother of David's existence. He viewed his relationship with Janet as a brief, forgettable mistake, and the child as an inconvenient consequence. He had made sure his mother never learned about her grandson, a decision he now regretted with a bitter, all-consuming resentment. But Eleanor, with a foresight that bordered on the preternatural, had taken precautions. Her will, a document of almost biblical complexity, had created a special trust. A trust not for Robert, but for David, her unknown grandson. The fund, a substantial $1.7 million, was to be held in trust, accessible to David on his 18th birthday. But there was a provisional loophole that had sent a jolt of ice-cold adrenaline through Robert. When his lawyers unearthed it, the funds could also be released to David's legal guardian for his care and educational expenses, should that guardian be Robert Wellington. The moment he heard this, David ceased to be a ghost and became a prize, a solution, a key that could unlock his financial salvation. Robert's mind, a machine finely tuned to calculate risk and profit, immediately began to work. He didn't see a boy. He saw a ledger entry. He didn't see a family. He saw a financial opportunity. This wasn't about love or paternal instinct. It was a hostile takeover. He was a hunter, and David, the son he had ignored for so long, was the most valuable prey he had ever found. The math was simple, and Ruthless obtained custody of the boy, gain access to the trust fund, and use the money to pay off his debts and salvage his crumbling empire. To execute his plan, he needed a professional. He turned to Dr. Mitchell, a man whose reputation was as unassailable as his ethics were questionable. Dr. Mitchell was a shark in a world of minnows, a master of a narrative that favored wealth and power over truth and emotion. They met in the sterile, high-tech conference room of Mitchell's firm, a room with views of the very buildings Robert's company had built monuments to a success that was now ironically hollow. "It's a straightforward case," Dr. Mitchell said, his voice a low, confident hum, as he swiped through a presentation on a large wall-mounted screen. "We have all the advantages. You are a man of means, a pillar of the community. You can offer the boy a life she could never dream of. Private schools, tutors, trips abroad. We'll paint Ms. Thompson as well-meaning but fundamentally ill-equipped to provide for a gifted child's needs. Her job, her home, her modest income, it all plays into our narrative." Robert nodded, his eyes fixed on the screen where a grainy photo of Janet and David stood next to a smiling, idealized image of a private school brochure. He felt a fleeting sense of superiority, a smugness that this was all so easy. He hadn't given a thought to the boy in years, hadn't even bothered to show up for his birthdays. But now all of a sudden he was to be a doting father, a savior. The hypocrisy was a bitter taste in his mouth, but a necessary one. "The boy," Robert said, his voice a low growl. "He's a bit strange, quiet. He spends all his time with his nose in a book." Dr. Mitchell chuckled. "That's not a problem, Robert. That's an advantage. We'll present it as evidence of his brilliance, a brilliance that is being wasted by his current circumstances. We'll argue that he deserves a better life, a life you can provide. He's a smart kid. He'll understand that this is for his own good. He'll come around." They discussed the minutiae of their strategy. They would send private investigators to document Janet's modest lifestyle, her long hours, her financial struggles. They would use her limited resources as a weapon against her, twisting her hard work and dedication into a form of neglect. They would paint David's modest school as an educational graveyard, a place where a child of his potential was being stifled. The plan was airtight. It was clean. It was, in their cold-blooded estimation, a guaranteed victory. They were so consumed by their own cleverness, by the elegant brutality of their legal strategy, that they failed to consider the one variable they could not control. They saw a boy as a pawn, a problem to be solved, a key to a vault. They saw a woman as an obstacle, a minor inconvenience to be swept aside. They were masters of the game, and they believed with a deep and unshakable certainty that they had already won. Back in his office, as a cold rain began to fall against the glass of his skyscraper, Robert Wellington looked out over the city he had helped build. He felt a fleeting moment of self-satisfaction. The humiliation of the past year would soon be a distant memory. He would have the money, his reputation would be repaired, and his son, the boy he had just planned to banish to a military academy, would become a tool for his own salvation. He had prepared for every angle, every possible setback. He had not, however, prepared for the possibility that the boy, the pawn he had so easily dismissed, was the only one who truly understood the game. He was the hunter. He just didn't realize his prey was a lion in a lamb's clothing. The clock on the wall of Janet Thompson's small apartment ticked with a rhythm that felt both slow and impossibly fast. The letter from the court, a thin, formal sheet of paper, lay on the kitchen table like a death sentence. To David, it was more than just a summons. It was a declaration of war. He watched his mother, her shoulders slumped with the weight of a burden she had always carried alone. He saw the lines of worry on her face deepen with each passing day. The man he had seen only 4 times in his life, a figure of remote, fleeting arrogance, was now a threat. He was not coming for a visit. He was coming to take. For a child who had always found comfort and order in the pages of books, the world suddenly felt illogical, unfair, and profoundly wrong. The court, a place he had only seen on television, was meant to be a place of justice, not a weapon wielded by the powerful against the defenseless. He felt a deep, burning sense of injustice, a feeling so strong it moved him from a state of passive fear to active determination. He was not a lawyer, he was not an adult, but he was not powerless. He could read. He could think. And most importantly, he had a secret weapon, the Central Public Library. It was a Tuesday afternoon when he first made the pilgrimage, his school backpack heavy with textbooks, his mind heavier with purpose. The Central Public Library was a grand, imposing building of stone and glass, a monument to the democratizing power of knowledge. Inside, the air was a gentle mixture of old paper and the quiet hum of fluorescent lights. He found his way to the reference section, a vast labyrinth of shelves and computers. This was where he first encountered Ms. Rodriguez. Ms. Rodriguez was a woman who seemed to have been created specifically for her role. Her hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and her glasses rested on the bridge of her nose, but her eyes, brown and perceptive, held a warmth that was at odds with her stern exterior. She watched David from her post at the central desk, a small boy in a world of serious adults. He approached her, his voice a quiet whisper in the cavernous room. "Excuse me," he said, his hands clasped behind his back. "I'm looking for books on family law." Ms. Rodriguez raised an eyebrow, a flicker of amusement crossing her face. "A school project?" she asked, her voice soft. David shook his head. "A personal project." She led him to the appropriate section, a row of thick, imposing volumes, with titles like The American Legal System and Illinois Family Code. She expected him to skim them, to lose interest quickly. Children always did. But David did not. He pulled a heavy book from the shelf, his small arms straining, and carried it to a quiet table in the corner. He began to read, his brow furrowed in concentration. Ms. Rodriguez, intrigued, watched him from a distance. He didn't just look at the pictures. He was dissecting the text, his fingers tracing legal terms he couldn't possibly understand. He was not a child playing make-believe. He was a student, a scholar of a terrifying subject, driven by a desperate, powerful need. Over the next few weeks, David's visits became a regular, sacred ritual. Every Tuesday and Thursday after school, he would arrive at the library, a small, determined figure. He no longer needed Ms. Rodriguez to show him where the books were. He had memorized the layout of the legal section, but his needs became more complex. One afternoon, he approached her with a question that stopped her in her tracks. "Ms. Rodriguez," he said, looking up from his notebook, "how do you find public records of corporate lawsuits?" She stared at him for a long moment, a slow, dawning realization spreading across her face. This was not just curiosity. This was an investigation. She led him to a computer terminal, and with a quiet solemnity began to teach him. She showed him how to access public legal databases, how to search for court dockets and filings, how to use keywords to sift through thousands of documents. She taught him about the difference between civil and criminal cases, about the meaning of petitioners and respondents. She was no longer just a librarian. She had become his guide, his confidant, his quiet co-conspirator. The work was painstaking, tedious, and often frustrating. David spent hours poring over dry technical documents. He learned to read between the lines, to see patterns in a series of failed business ventures and anonymous lawsuits. He found records of Wellington Industries, a trail of legal entanglements that spoke of a ruthless business strategy. He found references to a Wellington Industries versus the people, and began to piece together a story. He uncovered legal notices, newspaper articles from local archives, and even old property records that detailed how Robert Wellington had acquired certain buildings. The more he learned, the more the man he knew as his biological father ceased to be a ghost and became a monster. He found evidence of a pattern of predatory behavior, a history of taking advantage of the weak and vulnerable for financial gain. He found a news article detailing how Wellington Industries had acquired a small family-owned bakery from a desperate immigrant family, the Santos, who were behind on their loan payments. The article, buried in the digital archives of a local paper, painted a picture of a heartless transaction, a man preying on a family's misfortune. David's sense of purpose, already burning brightly, was now a roaring fire. This wasn't just about him and his mom. This was about a pattern, a trail of destruction that had to be stopped. Ms. Rodriguez watched his progress with a mix of awe and concern. She saw the heavy toll the work was taking on him, the way his shoulders would sometimes slump in exhaustion, the weight in his eyes when he stumbled upon a particularly heartless detail. One day, as she watched him organize a series of printed-out documents into a manila folder with the precision of a seasoned lawyer, she approached him. "David," she said softly, her voice carrying a maternal concern. "What you're doing, it's a lot for a child." He looked up, his face serious. "I know. Why are you doing this?" He didn't answer with words. He reached into his backpack and pulled out a photo, a crumpled, well-loved picture of him and his mother sitting on their worn couch, both of them smiling. He placed it on the table. Ms. Rodriguez looked at the photo, then back at David. She understood. This wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about money. It was about love. It was about protecting the most important person in his life. She had seen countless people come to the library seeking knowledge, but never with such a pure and desperate purpose. She had taught him how to find information, but she realized with a humbling clarity that he had taught her something in return, that true knowledge is not just about facts and figures, but about the courage to use them for what is right. She gave him a small, encouraging smile and returned to her desk, leaving him to his work, a silent, powerful guardian of his newfound mission. David returned to his documents, the photo of his mother beside him. He had uncovered the first pieces of the puzzle, the financial misdeeds and the history of corporate ruthlessness. He had armed himself with a weapon forged not of steel, but of information. The hunter he knew was coming for his family, but what the hunter did not realize was that his intended prey had been preparing quietly and methodically in the hallowed halls of a public library. The next step, he knew, was to find the real motive, the secret that would turn the tide in their favor. The silence that had fallen over Courtroom 7B was not one of peace, but of a great collective breath being held. All eyes were on David Thompson, the 9-year-old boy who had dared to stand against a giant. He stood there, a small yet utterly formidable figure, holding a worn school notebook that now seemed to possess the weight and power of an ancient tome. The contrast between his small stature and the immense audacity of his actions was a spectacle no one present would ever forget. Robert Wellington, seated with the rigid posture of a man fighting a dawning panic, watched his son. He had expected tears please a child's tantrum. He had not expected this. He had not expected a mind as sharp and strategic as a general's. He leaned over to Dr. Mitchell, his voice a low, urgent hiss. "This is ridiculous. Get him to stop. This is a family matter, not a corporate trial." Dr. Mitchell, however, had no words. His usual sharp retort, his legal acumen, had been neutralized by the very source of David's power, the truth. He could not object to what was being said because everything the boy had said so far was a matter of public record. The law was on David's side. David did not look at them. He opened his notebook with a slow, deliberate movement, the sound of the pages turning a rustle of paper that seemed to echo through the silent room. He did not start with a grand statement. He started with a single, simple question. "Your Honor." He began, his voice calm and steady. "I believe that a person's character is shown not just by their words but by their actions, and I have discovered a pattern of behavior that I believe the court needs to understand." He reached into his backpack, a simple black bag that looked too big for his frame, and pulled out a surprisingly organized manila folder. The folder was thick, and he handled it with a care that suggested its contents were immensely valuable. He placed it on the table in front of him and opened it. The sight of the neatly arranged documents, photocopied and numbered, was more damning than any angry outburst could have been. Over the last 5 years, David said, his eyes scanning the documents. Wellington Industries, the company owned by the petitioner, has faced 17 separate lawsuits. 16 of these were settled out of court. One went to trial and resulted in a verdict against the petitioner. He paused, his gaze lifting to meet Robert's, and for a fleeting moment a cold, hard truth passed between them. These cases weren't from big corporations. They were from families, small businesses, people who were financially vulnerable. Robert Wellington's face, which had been pale with anger, now turned a pasty white. He opened his mouth to protest, to deny, but no sound came out. This was information his lawyers had buried, part of the normal cost of doing business. It was not supposed to be public. It was not supposed to be known. Dr. Mitchell finally found his voice. "Your Honor, this is irrelevant. My client's business practices have no bearing on his ability to be a father." "It has everything to do with it," David corrected, his voice cutting through the objection like a sharp blade. "It shows a pattern, a man who preys on vulnerable families for financial gain, and now he's trying to prey on his own vulnerable family for the same reason." The simplicity of the logic was devastating. The truth was unassailable. Judge Harrison's expression, which had been one of cautious curiosity, hardened into something deeply serious. He nodded, gesturing for David to continue. He had seen this kind of pattern before, but never presented by a 9-year-old boy. David pulled out a series of printed photographs from the folder. They were grainy images of a small storefront, a building with a sign that read, Santos Bakery. The photos were old, but they were clear enough to show a vibrant, happy business. This, David said, his voice dropping to a somber tone, is the Santos family. Immigrants from Mexico who worked 18 hours a day to build a life for themselves. They had a small bakery in a neighborhood Mr. Wellington was trying to redevelop. They were 3 months behind on their loan due to an emergency hospitalization of their youngest son. He looked up, his eyes now fixed on the judge, his small frame radiating a quiet power that filled the room. Mr. Wellington found out about their financial troubles through a friend at their bank. He sent his agents to them, offering to buy their property for less than half its market value. When they refused, he threatened to foreclose. He used their child's illness as a weapon. A collective intake of breath swept through the courtroom. Robert Wellington was visibly sweating now, a bead of perspiration tracing a path down his temple. The story presented with such heartbreaking clarity was a far cry from the dry legal documents that had inspired it. This was not a legal argument. It was a moral one. It was a story of a man without a conscience, a man who saw human suffering not as a tragedy, but as a business opportunity. Janet Thompson, watching from her seat, felt a mixture of profound pride and bone-deep fear. She had always known Robert was cold, but she had never known the extent of his cruelty. She had thought she was facing a wealthy man who simply wanted his son. But David had just revealed a monster, a man who had built his wealth on the broken backs of others. And now he was trying to do the same to her. The Santos family lost their bakery. David continued, his voice quiet but firm. They lost their business. They lost everything they had worked for. But they were not the only ones. There were 16 others. Small businesses, single parents, elderly homeowners. People who were in distress, and who Mr. Wellington chose to profit from instead of helping. Dr. Mitchell rose again, his face a mask of desperation. Your Honor, this is character assassination. These are baseless allegations. They are not baseless, David countered, pulling another document from his folder. This is a copy of the official court record. This is a certified transcript from the Santos family lawsuit. It's all public information, Mr. Wellington. He said, his eyes meeting Robert's again, a hint of something that was not hatred, but a deep, profound sadness in their depths. Mrs. Rodriguez taught me that the truth is almost always publicly available. You just have to know where to look. Robert Wellington slumped back in his chair, defeated. The meticulously crafted facade of a caring, responsible father was crumbling around him, replaced by the ugly, undeniable truth of his character. He had come to court prepared to fight a battle of money and class. But his opponent had chosen a different battlefield, one of morality and human decency. He had expected to face a frightened woman and a quiet boy, but he had found himself staring into the face of a 9-year-old prosecutor, a child who had uncovered secrets that not even his own lawyers knew. The courtroom was still, the air thick with the weight of David's words. The little boy had not yet spoken of the trust fund. He had not yet revealed the financial motive. He had simply laid bare the truth of the man's soul, a truth that was more damning than any accusation of fraud. He had won the moral argument. The legal one was about to begin. The final piece of the puzzle, the one that would prove beyond a shadow of a doubt why Robert Wellington had suddenly reappeared in his son's life, was still in the folder waiting to be revealed. And everyone in the courtroom, from the judge to the most cynical journalist, knew with a chilling certainty that what was to come would be even more devastating. The silence that had settled over the courtroom was no longer one of mere anticipation. It was the heavy quiet that follows a great and unassailable truth. David had laid bare the moral failings of Robert Wellington, stripping away the polished veneer of his success to reveal the predatory nature beneath. Robert, his face a mask of shock and fury, could not deny what the public records had already confirmed. Dr. Mitchell, flustered and defeated in his previous argument, was trying to find a new footing, but the ground had shifted entirely. David, however, was not finished. He took a deep, steadying breath, his small chest rising and falling with the weight of the moment. He had meticulously planned his attack, and the moral argument was only the first part of the assault. Now, he was ready to deliver the final crushing blow, the one that would prove beyond any shadow of a doubt that Robert Wellington's sudden paternal instinct was a lie, a carefully constructed fiction built on a foundation of greed. Your Honor, David began, his voice dropping to a low, serious tone. I have just shown that the petitioner has a documented history of profiting from the misery of others. But I have not yet explained why he has chosen to set his sights on my family now. The answer, I believe, is found in a secret he has kept from me my entire life. He looked directly at Robert, and for the first time, a flicker of true fear passed through the man's eyes. This wasn't just a child with a folder of lawsuits. This was a child who knew something personal, something hidden. Robert's mind raced, searching for what the boy could possibly know. He had been so careful. My biological father, David, continued, his voice void of emotion, never told his own mother, my paternal grandmother, Eleanor Wellington, that he had a son. He never introduced me to her. He never allowed her to know that she had a grandson. A gasp echoed in the gallery. Judge Harrison's eyes widened slightly. This was a startling revelation, one that cast a new and much darker light on Robert's character. My grandmother, David went on, and now a note of quiet reverence entered his voice, was not a woman who could be easily deceived. I have discovered through the public estate records that she suspected her son of living a life of deceit, and that she hired private investigators to keep an eye on his affairs. These investigators, after much time, discovered me. They discovered that her son had a grandson she had never met. He paused, letting the information sink in. Robert Wellington looked as if he had been struck by an invisible fist. The existence of the private investigators, a fact he had never known, was a betrayal from the grave. His mother, the one person he had never been able to truly deceive, had seen through him even in death. When she learned of my existence, David said, his voice now filled with a quiet power. My grandmother, a woman who truly understood the meaning of a legacy, immediately created a trust fund. A trust fund specifically for me, to protect me from the very man who is now trying to get custody of me. He reached into his folder and pulled out a single large document. It was a certified copy of the trust fund's founding documents. He placed it on the table, the official stamps and signatures, a stark contrast to the small scribbled notebook. Your Honor, David said, this trust fund contains $1.7 million, a sum set aside for my education and care. It was a gift from a grandmother who loved me even before she knew me. But this gift came with a condition that was designed to be a test of character. He turned a page in his notebook, the silence in the room absolute. The money, he explained, was to be released to me, the beneficiary, on my 18th birthday. But it also had a provision that allowed my biological father, the petitioner, to access the funds for my care and education, if and only if he gained full legal custody of me. My grandmother, in her incredible wisdom, set this condition to see if her son would ever choose a path of genuine commitment and responsibility. Robert Wellington finally found his voice, a choked, desperate sound. This is ridiculous. This is a fabrication. He yelled, his composure shattering. My mother would never do something like this to me. This is a lie. It is not a lie, Mr. Wellington, David said, his voice as calm as a placid lake, a stark and chilling contrast to his father's outburst. It is the truth, and the truth is, my grandmother knew you better than you knew yourself. She had a profound understanding of your character, and she knew that you would never seek custody of me for any reason other than money. He then delivered the final, devastating blow. The math is simple and cruel, Your Honor. For 7 years, my biological father never mentioned my existence. He lost his chance to access this inheritance through natural custody. Now, in the last year, faced with a failed lawsuit and an expensive divorce, he has suddenly found his paternal instincts. He has come here not to be a father to me, but to use me as a key to unlock a bank account. The gallery gasped. The journalists began to scribble furiously. The story had changed from a simple custody battle to a modern-day Greek tragedy, a tale of a man undone by his own greed. Dr. Mitchell, who had no knowledge of this specific trust fund, felt the entire case, his entire reputation, crumble around him. His client had lied to him not just with his words, but with his omissions. He looked at Robert Wellington not as a client, but as a sinking ship, a man whose lies were so vast they had consumed his own legal counsel. Judge Harrison, his face now a study in cold, hard determination, looked at the documents David had presented, then at the man who had come into his courtroom with a casual air of invincibility. The evidence was irrefutable. The motive was as clear as day. Robert Wellington was a predator, a man who saw his own son not as a child to be loved, but as a financial asset to be exploited. Janet Thompson's hands were no longer clutching her handbag. She had placed them on her son's shoulder, a gesture of silent strength and support. The tears that streamed down her face were not of fear, but of a profound and overwhelming relief. For 9 years she had fought to protect her son, but she had never been able to fight this particular monster. But David, her David had. He had not just uncovered a trust fund, he had uncovered the truth. The court was no longer about who was more fit to be a parent. It was about who was and who was not a human being. The verdict in David's mind had already been delivered. The final formal ruling was now just a matter of protocol. A chilling silence had fallen over the courtroom. The revelation of the trust fund was more than a legal blow. It was a psychological one, exposing the cold, calculated heart of Robert Wellington. His face, a mask of aristocratic composure for so long, had now crumpled into a twisted expression of shock and betrayal. He looked at his son, not with anger, but with the cold, uncomprehending stare of a man who had been outmaneuvered by a ghost he never knew existed. Dr. Mitchell, his confidence evaporated, stood at his side, a broken man. The case was already lost in all but name. But David, standing in the center of it all, was not yet finished. He had saved his most devastating piece of evidence for last, a final, unassailable proof of his father's true intentions. He had uncovered the financial schemes and the predatory history, but now he was about to prove the emotional cruelty, the ultimate betrayal of a father's duty. "Your Honor," David said, his voice quiet, almost a whisper, as if he were hesitant to bring forth the ugliness he had found. "I have also discovered the petitioner's true educational plans for me. Plans that I believe the court will find very illuminating." He reached into his backpack once more, a bag that now seemed to be a Pandora's box of damning secrets, and pulled out a small metallic object. It was a digital voice recorder, no bigger than his palm. He held it up for the judge and the court to see. Robert's eyes widened in horror. He knew that device. He had seen it on David's desk during his last visit to the apartment a few weeks before the lawsuit had been filed. He had dismissed it as a child's toy, an inconsequential gadget. He had been a fool. The full, terrifying scope of his son's quiet, methodical preparation began to dawn on him. The boy wasn't just smart. He was a master strategist. "Your Honor," Dr. Mitchell interjected. His voice hoarse. "Private conversations are not admissible evidence. This is a violation of my client's privacy." "I can prove every word," David said, his voice cutting through the objection with a sharp finality. "This was recorded in my mother's apartment in a public space 6 months ago. As my mother's lawyer, and as the subject of the conversation, I believe I have the right to present it." He looked at Judge Harrison, his eyes holding a plea for a chance to be heard. The judge, his face grim, nodded once. "Mr. Thompson, you may proceed. However, I caution you, this is a very serious step." "I am certain, Your Honor," David said, his hand trembling only slightly as he pressed the play button. The silence that followed was deafening. Every person in the room leaned forward, their anticipation, a tangible force. Then a voice, a familiar, unmistakable voice, filled the courtroom. It was Robert Wellington's. "Listen as soon as I get legal custody," the recorded voice said, cold and casual, as if discussing a business deal. "The boy is going straight to Riverside Military Academy. It's a strict boarding school in Colorado. They know how to handle difficult children." Janet Thompson gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. She had known Robert was cruel, but she had never imagined this. The idea of him sending David away so far to a place designed to break spirits sent a shiver of pure dread down her spine. The voice continued, a monologue of unfeeling calculation. "He'll stay there until he's 18. I'll have full access to the inheritance funds for educational expenses. The rest is mine. The kid doesn't even have to know about the money. It's a perfect solution. She's out of the picture. I have access to the funds. And I still look like a responsible father." The finality of the words, the sheer brazen contempt for both Janet and David, hung in the air like a noxious gas. The recording was not just a conversation. It was an act of emotional violence, a confession of the highest order. Robert Wellington, his face now completely white, stared at the small black device as if it were a bomb, his own voice, a ghost from a past lie, come back to haunt him. "There's more," David said, his voice shaking with a quiet fury he had held in check for so long. He stopped the recording and a heavy silence descended. This part is about what he really thinks of me. He pressed play again. The problem isn't just the money. Robert's voice said, the tone now one of cold, cynical disdain. It's that the boy is too smart for his own good. He asks questions, he observes everything. It would be best to keep him out of the picture until he's 18, and I can sort out the financial situation. Kids like him, well, we don't want him getting any ideas above his station. The recording stopped. Robert Wellington's face was a study in pure, unadulterated terror. He had been caught not by a lawyer, not by the system, but by the very person he had tried to exploit. The boy he had dismissed as a problem had become a living, breathing record of his crimes. He finally snapped, his voice a roar of pure animal rage. "This is a trap," he screamed, leaping to his feet. "He provoked me on purpose. A 9-year-old boy can't." "A 9-year-old can't." What? David interrupted, his voice cutting through his father's outburst with a calm that was more chilling than any scream. "Can't be smart. Can't defend himself. Can't expose the truth about a father who sees him as a problem to be solved." The words, so full of a quiet adult wisdom, seemed to suck all the air out of the room. Robert Wellington, his expensive suit now crumpled and stained with sweat, looked at the small boy who had just dismantled his entire life. The empire he had built on lies was crumbling around him, and the person holding the wrecking ball was his own son. Judge Harrison, his face now a mask of cold judicial fury, turned off the tape recorder. He looked directly at Robert Wellington, his gaze a condemnation more powerful than any verdict. He had presided over cases of fraud, of abuse, of every kind of human evil, but he had never witnessed a betrayal so cold, so complete. The evidence was not just a recording. It was a window into a man's soul, a soul so corrupted by greed that he was willing to use his own child as a stepping stone to salvation, then cast him aside like a broken tool. The case in that moment was over. The custody hearing was a foregone conclusion. The only question that remained was what the full weight of the justice system and the full weight of a son's heart would bring down upon the head of Robert Wellington. The hunter had become the hunted, and the lion in a lamb's clothing had just delivered the final fatal blow. The silence in Courtroom 7B was absolute, a void of sound, filled only by the raw, ragged breathing of Robert Wellington. He stood there, a ruined monument to his own hubris. His suit crumpled, his face a landscape of shock and defeat. The echoes of his own voice, so cold and dismissive on the small black recorder, had sentenced him more effectively than any prosecutor could have. The hunter, so confident in his plan, was now the prey. Judge Harrison, his face a study in grim finality, turned his gaze from the boy to the man. For a full minute he said nothing, his eyes so full of a tired wisdom, now gleaming with a quiet fury. He had seen thousands of cases in his career, but this was different. This was not just a legal matter. It was a moral abomination. A man had come into his court, not just to take his son, but to use him, to discard him, to treat him as a financial instrument. The judge felt a sense of personal offense, a violation of the very principles of family and decency he was sworn to uphold. He picked up his gavel, a simple block of wood that now seemed to possess the full weighty power of the law. He did not bang it. He simply held it, his knuckles white against the dark wood. His voice, when it came, was not the weary baritone from before, but a low, steel-edged command that filled the room. "Mr. Wellington," he began, his voice devoid of any pretense of courtesy. "The evidence presented today by a witness who has demonstrated an articulation and moral clarity far beyond your own paints, a picture that is, in a word, abhorrent. Your financial motives are undeniable. Your character has been exposed as that of a predator, and your recorded intentions for this child are a testament to a level of cold-blooded cruelty I have rarely witnessed in this court." Robert's face twitched. He opened his mouth to protest, but the judge's glare silenced him instantly. The testimony of David Thompson, including the financial documents he obtained from public records, and the evidence he so carefully documented himself, has completely and utterly dismantled your case. You came here not to be a father, but to acquire a financial asset. You have demonstrated with your own words that you view your son as a problem to be solved and a fund to be plundered. Such a person is not only unfit to be a parent, such a person is a danger to a child. He finally brought the gavel down, a single decisive strike that resonated like a gunshot. Based on all the evidence presented, Judge Harrison stated, his voice ringing with authority, "The petitioner's request for custody is hereby and categorically denied. Furthermore, I order a full, immediate, and comprehensive investigation into the fraudulent establishment of the Eleanor Wellington Trust Fund and into the predatory business practices of Wellington Industries, as so clearly documented by this brave young man." A wave of murmuring swept through the gallery. The journalists were a flurry of motion, their pens flying across their notebooks. This wasn't just a verdict, it was a public execution. Dr. Mitchell, pale and defeated, leaned over to whisper something to Robert, but Robert didn't hear him. He was a man trapped in a private hell, surrounded by the public wreckage of his own making. Then the judge did something that was almost unprecedented. He looked at David, his stern expression softening, and gave a small, almost imperceptible nod of respect. "David Thompson," he said, his voice now gentle, "your courage and your intelligence have not only saved your family, you have exposed an injustice that the system would otherwise have missed. The court applauds you." The praise, so rare and so sincere, seemed to fill David's small frame with a quiet pride. He stood there still and calm, a small beacon of light in the wreckage of a man's life. It was then that the court bailiffs, their faces grim, moved to Robert Wellington. He was told to stand, and as he did, one of them, with a quiet, efficient motion, placed his hands behind his back. The sharp click of the handcuffs was the final, devastating sound of his downfall. The mighty Robert Wellington, the man who had built an empire, was now a common criminal, his dignity stripped away, his freedom gone. As the bailiffs led him out, he turned his head for a final desperate look at his son. His face, once so arrogant and cold, was now a mask of pure, unadulterated shock and a dawning comprehension of the magnitude of his loss. He saw his son, the boy he had dismissed as an afterthought, as a problem to be solved, as an object to be used. And in that moment he realized what he had lost. He had not just lost a custody battle. He had lost a son who, despite everything, had still come to court to fight for him, to show him the truth of his own dark heart. David met his father's gaze. There was no hatred in his eyes, no triumphant sneer. There was only a profound and weary sadness, the look of a child who had seen the worst of a man he had once hoped to call a father. His expression was a silent epitaph to a relationship that had never existed, a final unyielding judgment on a life that had been consumed by greed. The courtroom doors closed behind Robert Wellington, a final definitive sound that sealed his fate. The battle was over. David had won. The crowd began to stir, the reporters scrambling to call in the story, the onlookers whispering in awe. But in the center of the chaos, Janet Thompson knelt down, her hands gently holding David's face. Tears of relief and love streamed down her cheeks. She wrapped her arms around her son, holding him tightly, her heart bursting with a gratitude so deep it was a physical ache. The world was watching, but in that moment there were only two people in the room. A mother and the son who had just saved her, a small boy who had fought a giant, and won not with brute force, but with a quiet courage and a love that was stronger than any amount of money or power. Their lives, they knew, had just changed forever, but the most extraordinary part of their story had only just begun. The click of the courtroom doors closing behind Robert Wellington was not an end, but a beginning. It was the sound that launched 1,000 headlines, 1,000,000 social media posts, and a story that would ripple across the country like a seismic wave. Outside, the quiet dignity of the courtroom was replaced by a maelstrom of flashing cameras, shouted questions, and a collective human curiosity that was both ravenous and insatiable. David and Janet, still in the quiet bubble of their victory, were suddenly thrust into a blinding, disorienting spotlight. The story of the little boy who had become his mother's lawyer was the kind of human interest narrative that captivated the nation. The reporters who had just witnessed a man's empire crumble at the hands of his 9-year-old son scrambled to get the first word, the first image. The transcript of the recording, the details of the trust fund, and the emotional story of the Santos family were leaked almost immediately. The court hearing, a private family matter, became a national spectacle. Within hours, the video of David's calm, articulate testimony went viral. A short clip of him adjusting his glasses and quoting international law was shared millions of times. He was not a spectacle of pity. He was a symbol of defiance, of intelligence, of hope. He was the child who refused to be silenced, the small David who had faced a Goliath and won not with a sling, but with a notebook. The phrase, "every child has a voice," became a rallying cry on social media, used in hashtags and protest signs. The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. News anchors who usually reported on politics and finance dedicated entire segments to the boy's story. Legal experts weighed in stunned by David's preparation and the depth of his research. Child psychologists spoke of his emotional maturity and intellectual fortitude. He was called the boy lawyer, America's smartest kid, and the little barrister. David, overwhelmed by the attention, handled it all with the same quiet grace he had shown in court. He gave interviews always with his mother by his side, and always with the same message: the truth is a weapon, and children have more power than adults give them credit for. His story was more than just a passing news cycle. It sparked a social movement. In cities across the country, local advocacy groups began a campaign to give children a greater say in custody disputes. In state legislatures, bills were drafted to strengthen the legal rights of minors, ensuring that their voices would be heard in matters directly affecting their well-being. The David Thompson Act, as it was informally known, began to gain traction in several states, a testament to the fact that one boy's courage could lead to real, tangible change. The ripple effect of the verdict transformed Janet's life as well. She was no longer just a nursing assistant. She was the mother of a national hero. The hospital where she worked, moved by her story of dedication and resilience, not only promoted her to a supervisory position, but also established the Janet Thompson Program, a scholarship fund for the children of low-income employees, a direct legacy of her struggle and her son's fight. Janet, who had always shied away from the spotlight, found herself giving speeches, her quiet dignity and unwavering love for her son inspiring mothers and families everywhere. She was a living testament to the idea that true strength is not found in wealth, but in love and perseverance. As David's star rose, Robert Wellington's plummeted. The investigations ordered by Judge Harrison began to uncover a staggering web of deceit and financial misconduct. The news reports that hailed David as a hero were the very same ones that chronicled Robert's downfall. The lawsuits that David had so methodically documented were now being reopened, their damning details splashed across the front pages. His business partners sued him for fraud. His third wife's divorce lawyers seized the opportunity to demand an even larger share of his dwindling assets, and the bank called in his loans. Wellington Industries, a name that once commanded respect and fear, became a punchline. Its logo a symbol of greed and corruption. Robert lost everything: his company, his mansions, his reputation. He went from being a powerful figure in Chicago to a pariah, a man whose name was now synonymous with a child's victory and his own moral bankruptcy. The public loved the contrast. A small boy with nothing but a library card and a notebook had brought down a titan who had everything. It was a classic tale of good versus evil played out in the modern digital age. David, a child who had never asked for fame, found himself the reluctant face of a movement. His life, once a quiet existence of school and afternoons at the library, now a whirlwind of interviews and speaking engagements. But in the quiet moments late at night in their small apartment, Janet would watch her son, now no longer a boy, but a young man with a profound and serious purpose in his eyes. The courtroom victory was a beginning. The public fame was a tool. The real work, the true legacy, was just getting started. He had won the battle. Now he was ready to change the war. 3 years had passed since the day that had shattered a life and created a legend. The media frenzy had subsided into a quieter, more respectful kind of fame. David Thompson's face no longer graced the front pages every day, but his story had become a permanent fixture in the nation's consciousness, a modern-day fable about the power of truth and the victory of a child's courage. The boy who had once been an afterthought was now a symbol of hope. Meanwhile, Robert Wellington's world had shrunk to a fraction of its former size. He was a ghost in the city he had once commanded his name, now a whispered cautionary tale. The legal investigation ordered by Judge Harrison had turned over every stone of Wellington Industries, revealing a vast and intricate web of financial fraud, insider trading, and predatory schemes that made the Santos family lawsuit seem like a minor offense. Robert lost everything. His properties were seized. His accounts were frozen, and his company was liquidated. His divorce, a final brutal chapter in his life of luxury, left him with nothing. The man who had once owned a skyscraper now lived in a small one-bedroom studio apartment in the quiet suburbs of Chicago, the kind of apartment he would have once scoffed at. His days were a monotonous grind of small humiliations. He worked as a salesman at an electronics store, the only job he could find with his tarnished reputation. He wore simple, inexpensive clothes and ate meals he made for himself. He was no longer a man who had people to serve him. He was a man who served others. His hair had turned a dull gray, and the arrogance that had once defined his face was replaced by a perpetual look of weary defeat. But the most painful punishment was not his poverty. It was the television. He would turn it on, seeking a distraction from the crushing emptiness of his life, only to find David's face smiling back at him. Not a mocking smile, not a triumphant smile, but a genuine, happy smile. There would be a segment about David's latest speaking engagement at a university, a news report on the success of his nonprofit foundation, or an interview with a journalist who still found his story endlessly fascinating. David had never once in all his interviews spoken ill of his father. When asked, he would always respond with a maturity that was almost unbearable for Robert to hear. "I hope he finds peace," David had said in a recent interview. "Holding a grudge doesn't help anyone, but setting boundaries is essential to protecting those we love." The words were a condemnation more powerful than any legal verdict. David's success was not a form of revenge. It was a testament to the life Robert could have had, the son he could have known, had he not been blinded by his own greed. In stark contrast, David Thompson's life was a testament to the transformative power of purpose. At 12 years old, he was no longer just the boy who had won a court case. He was a leader, a changemaker. His brilliance, once a quiet private flame, now burned for others. He had channeled the trauma of his court case into a singular, beautiful mission. With the proceeds from his best-selling book, Every Child Has a Voice, David and his mother had established a nonprofit foundation. Its mission was simple and profound: to empower other children to fight for their rights. His first major initiative, born from his own experience, was a project to create small legal resource sections in public libraries across the country. He had worked with his mentor, Ms. Rodriguez, who had become the director of the project, and a team of pro bono lawyers, to curate a collection of books on family law and children's rights, written in simple, accessible language. Each section also included a computer, with free access to basic legal databases. David and his mother would travel to different cities for the launch of these legal libraries. They were no longer a frightened woman and her son, but a powerful team, their story a beacon of hope for families in crisis. Janet, in her new role as a nursing supervisor, had become a sought-after speaker for working mothers groups, her quiet strength and gentle demeanor inspiring millions. She watched her son with a mother's fierce pride, seeing how he had taken a moment of profound pain and turned it into a source of immense good. He had not just survived the storm, he had learned to sail through it and guide others. One afternoon, a letter arrived, a thin envelope with a Los Angeles postmark. It was from a 10-year-old girl named Sofia Martinez. She wrote about her immigrant grandmother who was facing an unfair eviction. She had found one of David's libraries in her neighborhood, and using the resources there had helped her grandmother present her case to a local legal aid society. The letter ended with a simple, powerful sentence. "Thank you for teaching me that every child has a voice. I used mine and I saved my family." David carefully folded the letter and placed it in a special wooden box, where he kept all the letters he received, a growing monument to the lives he had touched. Janet came into his room and found him looking at the box, a small, knowing smile on his face. "How does it feel?" she asked, her voice soft with emotion, "to know that your courage has inspired so many people?" He looked up at her, and his eyes, so old for his age, were filled with a wisdom that transcended words. "Remember when you told me that sometimes the scariest things in life turn out to be the most important?" he asked. Janet nodded, remembering the conversation before the hearing perfectly. "I think I understand now, Mom. If Robert Wellington had never tried to tear us apart, I would never have discovered that a child can change the world when adults stop underestimating them." His victory was not just about winning a custody case. It was about forging a legacy, about using his pain to build a bridge for others. He had not just fought for his life. He had fought to change the world, one child, one family, one library at a time. The battle was over, but the war for justice had only just begun. The greatest chapter of his story, the one that would truly change the system forever, was still waiting to be written. The years that followed were a blur of purpose and relentless motion. David Thompson, no longer the boy in the courtroom, but a young man with a profound and serious mission, was a force of nature. He continued his work expanding the Legal Library Project and speaking at schools and universities across the country. He became a living example of the very principles he championed. A testament to the idea that a single voice armed with truth could change the world. And then when he was 16 years old, the world changed for him again. The letter arrived on a bright, crisp autumn morning, a thick, elegant envelope bearing the crest of Harvard University. Janet, who was now a supervisor at her hospital, watched with a pounding heart as David opened it, his hands so small in that courtroom now long and sure. It was not a simple acceptance letter. It was a full scholarship to a program that had been created in his honor, the first of its kind, the David Thompson Scholarship in Law and Social Justice, designed specifically for students who had demonstrated exceptional social leadership before the age of 16. The boy who was supposed to be sent to a military academy was now being courted by the most prestigious university in the world, not just for his intellect but for his character. He had won the war, and now the world was offering him a place at the head of the table. Years later, the morning sun broke over Cambridge, Massachusetts, casting long shadows across the historic campus. David Thompson, now 21 years old, sat in his apartment, a simple, tidy space filled with books and legal journals. He was dressed in a dark suit, his gaze calm and focused behind his now familiar glasses. Today was a milestone, the culmination of a decade-long journey. He had just been admitted to the bar, having completed his undergraduate degree and an accelerated law program, making him the youngest lawyer ever admitted in the history of the state. His first case, however, was not one for a major corporation or a wealthy client. It was a class-action lawsuit, a monumental undertaking that was years in the making. He was suing the American educational system. The charge was clear and audacious, for failing to teach children their fundamental legal rights. The case was met with initial derision. Critics called it a publicity stunt, a ridiculous overreach. But David, a veteran of impossible battles, was prepared. He and his team presented a mountain of evidence, from studies on childhood emotional abuse to case files of children caught in the system, a tragic mosaic of small voices that had never been heard. He argued that it was a constitutional failure, a systemic denial of due process for the nation's most vulnerable citizens. He won. The landmark case set a precedent that made mandatory legal education a requirement for all American students. It was a victory not just for David, but for every child who had ever felt small, powerless, and unheard. His first act as a lawyer was not to make money, but to change the world. Meanwhile, in a small, quiet apartment in Chicago, Robert Wellington sat watching the news. His hair was completely white, his face etched with the lines of a life that had turned out to be a profound failure. He was no longer a salesman. He was an electronics repairman, a job that paid his bills and allowed him to remain invisible. He watched the television, and there was David, his son, a young man who radiated a quiet strength, giving a press conference. He spoke with the same poise, the same unyielding calm he had shown on that day in the courtroom. The news anchor, a young woman with a clear voice, summarized the verdict. David Thompson's victory today has set a precedent that will change the lives of millions of children for generations to come. Robert watched, his heart a hollow ache in his chest. He had seen every one of David's victories over the years. He had seen the way his son had turned his own greed into a force for good. He had tried to steal a trust fund, a small sum in the grand scheme of his life, only to lose everything. He had tried to get rid of a son, only to create a legacy that would outlive them both. The boy he had tried to destroy had become exactly the kind of man he himself had never been able to be: honorable, compassionate, and truly powerful. He finally understood. David's revenge was not in taking something from him. It was in building something that he, Robert, could never have built. It was a monument to love and a testament to the idea that true strength is not found in money or power, but in a quiet courage and a willingness to fight for what is right. Robert turned off the television, the screen going dark. The quiet was a familiar friend now. He was alone with the memory of a son he had lost to his own greed. David Thompson's story is a powerful reminder that the universe has a way of conspiring in favor of the brave. He taught us that a 9-year-old boy with nothing but a public library and an unwavering determination could defeat a corrupt system. He showed us that the most valuable treasure is not gold or inheritance, but a heart filled with courage and a mind guided by truth. And he proved for all the world to see that we are never too small to make a difference, that our voices matter, and that every single one of us has the power to change not just our lives, but the world. Thank you for watching this story of courage, intelligence, and unconditional love. If this story has inspired you, please consider subscribing to the channel and giving this video a thumbs up. Your support helps us continue to share stories that prove the most unlikely heroes are the ones the world insists on underestimating.